Welcome back to the Free State, and today it's finally time for my post-midterm election analysis for 2022. As of this video, every House race except maybe for one has been called, every Senate race has been called, and every gubernatorial seat has been called as well. We already know that Republicans will have a narrow victory in the House and in governors, and Democrats will have a narrow majority in the Senate. So I think it's high time to give you my thoughts on this election and how and why it turned out the way it did, as well as the main takeaways from it. Buckle up, because this video could get long. So without further ado, here is a list of my general thoughts about the midterm election results. Number 1. The Dobbs decision is a setback for the pro-life cause. Yes, you read or heard that correctly. Like most conservatives and pro-lifers, I celebrated the overturning of Roe v. Wade back in June. It was one of the worst decisions in Supreme Court history, right up there with Dred Scott, Plessy, and Korematsu, and from a purely moral and legal perspective, its reversal was long overdue. But at the same time, I feared that the pro-choice backlash would prove to be stronger than the initial victory, and this election proved that to be the case, at least for now. Every single abortion-related ballot measure this year ended in victory for the pro-choice side, including the Bible Belt state of Kentucky and the relatively conservative, though more libertarian, state of Montana. California, Vermont, and my home state of Michigan all voted to enshrine abortion as a right in their state constitutions, effectively reinstating Roe in those states. If you're pro-life, then you have a right to be saddened by these outcomes, as I am, but let's not pretend that the Supreme Court didn't ask for it when they overturned Roe. It handed Democrats a big fat wedge issue to run on in the midterms, along with Trump on January 6th, to gin up suburban voters who might otherwise have gone Republican, as well as single women. As Ben Shapiro explained in his post-election analysis, exit polls showed single women voting so overwhelmingly for Democrats that they offset the Republican margins with single men, and married women combined. And I think a lot of the reason that pro-lifers have suffered such a devastating defeat in this year's election is because they have done a horrendous job of framing the issue in a way that is persuasive to people. I could go on and on about that, but I'll save the details for another video. Number 2. Donald Trump is still hurting Republicans. 2 years after Donald Trump left the presidency, he's attempted to maintain his influence in the Republican Party with some success. He's effectively used the fear of a primary challenge, as well as his attempts to delegitimize the 2020 election by accusations of voter fraud, to keep congressional Republicans from publicly breaking with him up to now. As I mentioned in the previous video, most of the candidates that Trump endorsed in the Republican primaries won, and just as consistently, they lost their general elections. Suburban voters who, as I said earlier, could have been won back for Republicans, went back to the Democrats because they didn't want to support someone that embraced Trump. The only Trump-endorsed statewide candidates to win competitive races were J.D. Vance in Ohio, Ted Budd in North Carolina, and Joe Lombardo in Nevada. The candidates who most consistently lost were not only the ones that were endorsed by Trump in the primaries, but also the ones that publicly endorsed Trump's 2020 election skepticism. What's interesting, though, is that most of these election doubters who lost conceded rather than claim fraud this time around. With Trump announcing his 2024 comeback bid almost immediately after the election, many Republicans who were too scared to publicly cross him before seem more open to doing so. It's also worth mentioning that Republicans who kept Trump at arm's length, particularly in the governor's races, did much better. Brian Kemp won a relatively easy re-election victory in Georgia. Chris Sununu was re-elected decisively in New Hampshire. Mike DeWine was re-elected by a landslide in Ohio. After losing to Greg Abbott in Texas, Beto O'Rourke is an even bigger laughingstock than before. But by far the biggest gubernatorial victory for Republicans was Ron DeSantis' 19.5 million vote routing of Charlie Crist to win a second term as Florida governor. Not only did DeSantis win convincingly with regular Republican voters in Florida like Cubans, white Anglos, and married women, but he also made inroads into Democrat-leaning constituencies. He won an outright majority of the Puerto Rican vote, a group that has been Democratic for decades. He won in the Democratic stronghold of Palm Beach County and in the somewhat less Democratic but still urbanized Miami-Dade County. I think it's safe to say at this point that should he choose to run for it, Ron DeSantis is the de facto alternative to Trump for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination. And plenty of Republicans implicitly understand this, which is why they so far haven't seemed to rush back to Trump to the same extent they did after 2020 and January 6th. Good Republican governance works and voters reward it. Giving fiery culture war speeches, ranting about the 2020 election, and cozying up to Trump doesn't work, and voters punish it, even if it excites the base. It's an excellent case of garbage in, garbage out. Nominate lousy candidates, and you get lousy results. And that brings us to the third item on the list, which is related to these first two. Number 3. Social issues and personalities are more salient for voters than the economy or education. For a number of years, I've pushed back against the common media narrative that people vote their pocketbooks. My response to that has always been, tell that to President Gore and President Romney. If the economy was the main issue people vote on, then Al Gore would have won easily in 2000, Mitt Romney would have won easily in 2012, and Donald Trump would have won re-election just as easily in 2020. Rich places full of fiscally conservative, socially liberal voters wouldn't vote so disproportionately for Democrats who want to raise their taxes and institute socialism. Sure, there are exceptions to this, like in 2008 when the recession played a big part in getting Obama elected, but that's just what they are, exceptions. I don't know how anyone can look objectively at the results of this year's midterm and still say that the economy is the main issue in every election. Inflation is at 40-year highs, gas prices are going above $3 and even $4 a gallon, violent crime is rising due to progressive Democrats defunding the police, schools are being filled with woke Marxist curriculum, supply chains are still messed up due to people not going back to work after the COVID lockdowns, yet Donald Trump and abortion mattered more to voters than all of that. I think this tweet by Allie Beth Stuckey summarizes it well, except for the fact that she ignores Trump's role. Or take this election night analysis on Fox News from Mark Thiessen.
I think there's a broader issue here, which is that, so think about this. We have the worst inflation in 4 decades, the worst collapse in real wages in 40 years, the worst crime wave since the 1990s, the worst border crisis in U.S. history. We have Joe Biden, who is the least popular president since Harry Truman, since presidential polling happened, and there wasn't a red wave. That is a searing indictment of the Republican Party. That is a searing indictment of the message that we have been sending to the voters. They looked at all of that and looked at the Republican alternative and said, no thanks. The Republican Party needs to do a really deep introspection look in the mirror right now, because this is an absolute disaster for the Republican Party, and we need to turn back. We need to look at who won today. Ron DeSantis, DeWine, these governors, Kemp, Abbott. Look at these governors. This is the path to the future.
Meanwhile, conservatives were dealt a huge setback on fighting wokeness in schools. Here in Michigan, Attorney General Dana Nessel, who publicly endorsed putting drag queens in every school, was reelected because Republicans chose to nominate a Trump-endorsed election skeptic rather than the man who barely lost to Nessel in 2018. In my largely conservative and religious hometown, a woke leftist from another community who wants to teach critical race theory got elected to the school board because 4 conservative candidates split the anti-CRT vote. Not only did Democrats sweep all the statewide executive offices for the second straight election, but Democrats won control of both chambers of the state legislature for the first time in about 40 years. That's literally longer than I've been alive. Remember when Glenn Youngkin won his race for governor of Virginia last year by focusing on education and cost of living? That's because he didn't embrace Trump like so many candidates this year. And that brings me to another thing. In poll after poll taken during Trump's presidency, suburban voters said that it was his personality, not his policies, that turned them off, and it's clear that this was the case again this time. Democrats preserved most of their suburban gains under Trump in races where Republicans nominated Trump-aligned candidates. Where traditional Republicans were nominated, they started to claw their way back in the suburbs. Candidate quality still matters. Polls also show that most Americans are against outlawing abortion prior to the second trimester, and the Dobbs decision prompted them to vote for Democrats who want abortion legal at all stages of pregnancy, and even after birth in some cases. If Republicans ever want to build another winning coalition, this is clearly not the way to do it. How many more elections do we have to lose? How many more years do Democrats have to be in charge to push their radical socialist agenda before Republican voters finally wake up and realize that Trumpism, rhino hunting, and ideological purity is a path to perpetual minority status? Number 4. Republicans shouldn't discount early or mail voting. As early voting has expanded in recent years, Republicans have generally been skeptical of it, and I'm no exception. I can understand why having a few days of early voting may be a good thing, but some states have expanded it out to a month or more. At that point, you basically defeat the purpose of Election Day and make it more like voting deadline day, but I digress. Anyway, for entirely understandable reasons, most Republicans have discounted the value of early voting. Why should it matter if Democrats dominate in the early vote if Republicans can offset it in the same day vote? Trump especially pushed his voters in 2020 to vote in person on Election Day rather than vote early in person or by mail. But just because that strategy may work in some elections doesn't mean it works all the time. In states like Pennsylvania, Nevada, and now Georgia, Republicans lost close Senate races in part because they ignored early voting and banked on their voters to turn out on Election Day. There's just no guarantee in any given election that the number of people who vote early won't be greater than the number who vote on Election Day, sometimes by a significant margin. Whatever your thoughts about early voting, simply conceding that vote to the Democrats proved itself in this election to be a huge mistake for Republicans. Number 5, incumbency prevailed more than usual. For all the hand-wringing about politicians we hear nowadays, voters seem especially unwilling to vote them out. The Senate elections this year were a good example of this. Every single incumbent senator who ran for re-election in this cycle won. That's almost unheard of. In most Senate election cycles, at least one incumbent goes down to defeat. I can't even think of the last time no incumbent senators lost in a cycle, if ever. Only one incumbent governor, Nevada's Steve Sisolak, lost his re-election campaign. I often think that people overestimate the advantages of incumbency because while it's true that most incumbents win another term, the advantages can become disadvantages if the incumbent is unpopular. Trump was an excellent example of this in 2020. He was a weaker candidate when he ran in 2020 than when he ran in 2016 because he actually had a record as president to run on, and most people didn't like it. But this time around, incumbency appeared to be an advantage to a larger degree than typical. That's about all I have to say about that, so now for the final point. Number 6, there will be more gridlock in the next Congress. If you think there's too much gridlock in the federal government right now, it will only continue for the next 2 years. With Republicans taking the House and Democrats expanding their Senate majority by only 1 seat, it will be extremely difficult for either party to get much of a legislative agenda passed. If both Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema defect, then they can block some of the more progressive proposals put out by other Senate Democrats. And if just a handful of House Republicans defect, they can derail the legislative goals of Kevin McCarthy and the rest of the party leadership. In fact, it's not even certain yet whether McCarthy will be Speaker in the next House. Freedom Caucus member Andy Biggs recently declared his candidacy, and he would need only 5 votes from the hardliners to deny McCarthy the Speaker's gavel. Whether or not he can get there is another question, but for now it's a very real possibility, as he got 3 votes in the party leadership election. That means he would only need to hold those 3 members and add 2 more. Either way, with split control of Congress, it's unlikely we will see any landmark legislation without bipartisan negotiation. With the disappointment that was this midterm election for Republicans, there have been a fair number of party leaders that have finally demanded that the GOP move on from Trump. It would be easy to dismiss this and say they'll fall back in line with him like they did after the January 6th riot and so many other times before that. But this time, I think it could be different. Republicans have several credible alternatives to Trump for the nomination in 2024 should they run. And polls since Election Day have even shown DeSantis pulling ahead of Trump in a 2-way matchup and in a number of state-level contests. High-level Trump donors who supported him in 2016 and 2020 have already announced they won't back him this time. Lee Zeldin, who just lost a close race for governor of New York, is considering a run for RNC chairman before Ronna Romney McDaniel, the current chair, even announced her intentions. That's a big deal. McDaniel is Mitt Romney's niece, but as chair she's been so strongly aligned with Trump that she stopped using the Romney part of her name. Of course, during Trump's presidency, Zeldin was an ally of him too, but in his gubernatorial bid, Zeldin made an effort, with some success, to make inroads in New York City while cutting the Democrats' early vote margins. Meanwhile, most state and county party organizations are still dominated by forever Trump folks, so getting them to move on could be more of a challenge. Sometimes parties can actually win by losing. John McCain and Mitt Romney's losses to Barack Obama allowed Republicans to make gains in the 2010 and 2014 midterms. Hillary Clinton's loss to Donald Trump allowed Democrats to take the House majority in 2018. Further back in time, Democrats' 3 straight presidential losses in the 1980s paved the way for a realignment with Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Republicans now have just such an opportunity going into 2024. Trump's standing in the party may now be weaker than at any time since the 2016 election. Let's hope that this is the beginning of something good. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and be sure to hit the bell notification to be informed whenever I put out a new video. I apologize for it being late, but I've been busy with graduate school and Christmas preparations, and I figured putting it out right after the Georgia runoff would be a good time for it. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, but please keep it analytical. Any hateful or divisive comments will be blocked. You have been warned. Until next time, this has been the Free State, signing out.